Hi, my name is John O'Reilly. I'm from Akita International University, and I'll be presenting today on two tropes that appear in many Japanese, in fact, almost all Japanese blockbusters that deal with the topic of blindness or visual impairment. The two tropes are sympathy and envy. So let's take a closer look. I only have 15 minutes, so I don't know how well it'll go, but I do feel like just about every major hit movie in the last 80 years in Japan that has dealt in some fashion with visual impairment has or can be separated into more sympathetic or more envious responses to blindness as a condition. Envy, that is, because purportedly superhuman powers sometimes result in, at least in pop culture, from the development of blindness. But it's really a spectrum, and actually most of the examples that we'll look at today are in the middle of the spectrum, sort of combining the two. Needless to say, neither of them are particularly healthy or maybe appropriate responses to visual impairment. In particular, as you can see here, they deny the possibility of empathy by othering the visually impaired individual. To feel sympathy, one must feel that one is more fortunate than someone else, and envy is to feel less fortunate than someone else. Either way, it's an obstacle to empathy. There are films that are empathetic towards the condition of visual impairment within Japanese society, and those films don't do well at the box office, unfortunately. And we'll talk about one possible explanation for why that is later on. This is, you see on the screen here is Kawase Naomi's Radiance from 2017, which is a remarkable film, but maybe actually as a result of challenging the kind of existing stereotypes of blindness in mainstream media, specifically cinema. It did not do well, or at least it didn't do, kind of enormous blockbuster level business. Unfortunately, it deserves to, but it's not up to me, unfortunately. But in fact, this film sort of denies the typical reaction of to pity someone. In the case of the blind individual being pitied by the sighted individual, is that subject position is kind of rejected by the film, which is quite interesting and very unusual. So there are many different cases, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list of depictions in Japanese cinema, I mean, of blindness as something to be pitied or something to be that should evoke a viewer's sympathy. We'll just look at a couple of examples. One, quite an extreme one, Kuroi Ame from 1989, and then eventually later on, well, also Kurama Tengu, but then later on a little bit more in depth about Gokugaku Bozu, this series of films starting in 1968. Which seems to be split almost evenly between sympathy and envy. So Kuroi Ame is interesting, partly because there's, it goes into, this is the 1989 film directed by Imamura Shohei, who is talking about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and then dealing with the kind of spectrum of discrimination of people who are suffering chronic radiation sickness, or even who are suspected of suffering chronic radiation sickness in the aftermath, 5 years later, of the actual atomic bombing. And one of the things that develops out of this kind of chronic radiation sickness story is several of the characters, at least two of the characters, seem to be going blind as a result, which is definitely worthwhile from a viewer manipulation point of view, because it makes us feel sympathy for the people going blind as their kind of spectacle of losing their sight. But kind of the irony or the kind of manipulation here is that there's no scientific explanation for chronic radiation sickness as opposed to acute radiation poisoning. There doesn't seem to be any way that could lead to blindness. So it's a kind of additional narrative wrinkle that's added to enhance sympathy, but doesn't actually make sense from a scientific point of view. So if we look at something like this is Yasuko, one of the main characters of the film, and she's has some kind of a tumor, and she's putting this aloe salve on it. Of course, she has to see what she's doing to be able to do it. And we discover in this scene, as I think you can start to sense even just from the non-diegetic music here, that she can't actually see very well. And the mirror is a very powerful kind of mark of sympathy. In other words, I don't necessarily think we're meant to empathize with Yasuko. We're meant to sympathize with her, her vision declining. because we are seeing this happen. And maybe that there's a kind of cruel irony in that as well. Anyway, one of the other secondary characters also goes blind, and this is kind of interesting case here. Actually, around the same time in the film. I can send you the timestamps if you're interested. Where this character goes blind as the kind of last stage before inevitable death due to radiation sickness. But this is 5 years after the bombing, and I'm not a expert in radiation, but I've never seen any scientific backing for the idea that radiation sickness can lead to blindness, at least chronic radiation sickness. So this is an addition by the filmmakers, perhaps also by the original source on which the story was based. Then the final and most evocative, most emotionally evocative scene is when Yasuko starts not seeing things that are there and seeing things that are not there. So there's this carp kind of fish in the pond, and one of the characters, her uncle, says, "Oh, it's the biggest one I've ever seen. I've never seen it before." And she starts to see this, but we know in fact that she's not seeing it because we get a POV shot that's kind of blurry from her point of view. It's difficult for her to see anything, and indeed at the end of the film she essentially goes entirely blind. It seems, it's suggested that she has gone completely blind by the end of the film. So that's one way of treating visual impairment on screen as a kind of, one of the terms that's come out by a theorist named Jervis is the spectacle of sympathy, that the bodies of visually impaired, or actually any other kind of impairment, individuals are put on screen so that we can experience a kind of pity slash reassurement that that isn't us. That is, it's a kind of othering process. Something similar is happening in Kurama Tengu with this character Oriki, who goes for surgery to the real life historical figure Hepburn, the eye doctor and missionary, and she is told in no uncertain terms that if she takes off her bandages before they've had time to heal, like 2 weeks or whatever it is, she will definitely go blind. But she's put into this high pressure situation where unless she takes action, the man that she loves, Kurata Tenzen, which is to say Kurama Tengu, and indeed the country she loves, in the form of the shipyard that's under threat, will be destroyed by the dastardly foreigners. So she comes to the kind of dramatic conclusion that she has no choice but to risk blindness, or really to guarantee her blindness, in order to save everyone, but especially maybe the man that she loves. It's a kind of romantic tragedy. We see here the kind of denouement at the end, where notice here that Ito Daisuke, the director, actually violated the 180-degree rule to make it absolutely clear that this is a big moment in the film. Kurata, who's struggling with the evil foreigner, is desperate to try and save her from this fate, but of course he can't. And not only does she accept blindness, she actually is shot to death in about 5 seconds. So she suffers the ultimate fate. And yet there may be a sense in which we're a little bit envious of her courage, at least, in risking all of this just to defend her, well, not lover, but the person that she's romantically interested in. And I think it's also worthwhile to point out that there's a literal hidden transcript in the movie where she's able to write in this kind of unique way of poking holes in paper, and the message therefore is only visible with the use of kind of backlighting. And Kurata is powerfully moved by this display of emotion, or by display of love. Well, that's more of the very sympathetic side. Then there's also a little bit more envious, admiringly envious side. And one of the good examples of that is Mimura Shinnojo from Bushi no Ichibun, or Love and Honor, the 2006 Yamada Yoji directed hit. I'll just show you this brief clip, which is the kind of big moment where we get a sense that being blind, it may not be a disadvantage. I mean, of course, it's obviously a disadvantage in certain ways in a duel, but here we get the sense that he's made it work to his advantage, partly through kind of almost guaranteed underestimation of the bad guy here. But the most interesting thing about this moment is that just afterwards, as the man is struggling, wounded, but definitely not fatally wounded, he is asked by a servant, Tokuhei, I think his name is, um, are you gonna kill him? Are you gonna deliver the kind of killing blow? And he says no, which is nice, because it allows us to feel envious of his kind of underestimated abilities, but also we don't feel guilt for supporting him because he's maintained his heroic kind of attitude. And that's a powerful contrast to Gokaku Bozu, which we're about to see. So yes, indeed, let's turn to the more primarily envy-focused projects. Obviously, you can see on the screen that there are many examples of this sort of blind superhero, or some kind of person with beyond human abilities, from Star Wars Rogue One or Daredevil, whatever. And there are many examples in Japan. Probably the most famous is Zatoichi, which we won't talk about today, but could be a very interesting parallel to Gokaku Bozu, which is, obviously directly inspired by Zatoichi in some ways, starring the half brother of Katsushintaro, no less. But I think we can all notice, if we sort of look carefully, that when villains show up in movies in Japan, and they appear to be blind, they're either faking it, as in Masquerade Hotel from 2019, or they're using it to become somehow beyond human kind of abilities. Of course, either way, we're not meant to empathize with them, but we might envy them in a sense. And a good example of this is Daibosatsu Toge's Yunosuke, who goes blind almost as a kind of karmic retribution for his evil deeds. And yet he also enhances his fighting abilities as a result of this. So this could be an interesting case of primarily envy that we're meant to feel. Of course, it's still an alienating feeling. We can't really identify with, as we don't take the subject position of Yunosuke. He's a kind of nihilistic monster, but we can envy his enhanced abilities. And there are lots of villains like this. This is one from the Zatoichi series, where Zatoichi, the blind warrior, and this blind crime lord fight. Obviously, in that sense, blindness is no disadvantage since they're both blind, but they are both superhuman as well. And there could be an element of, in the 1960s, after 1962, there was a kind of concerted effort by many in the filmmaking industry to find ways to, what we would call now, jump the shark. As people were sort of leaving the cinema and watching TV a lot more. How are you going to draw people back into the movie theater? Well, one way is to introduce like a new, never before seen gimmick, and then keep doing it until it's kind of tried and true stereotype. That's exactly what happened with Blindness, as a kind of condition to a spectacle really on screen. But one of the most remarkable such spectacles of all is this one, which is Gokaku Bozu. As you see here, this is the kind of key moment where the eponymous Gokaku Bozu, the evil, wicked monk, blinds his opponent. In a strange way, we might end up feeling sympathy for the opponent, Ryotatsu, here, as he's just been defeated in the duel. But we also feel envy by the end of the series, because he becomes even more powerful as a result of his blindness and becomes the kind of arch nemesis of Shinkai, the eponymous wicked monk. So Ryotatsu was actually in some ways almost more popular than Shinkai, and ended up getting his own spin-off film later on. Then there's the spectacle of Shinkai himself, who goes too far. He metes out the punishment of blindness to people he considers morally deficient. And maybe as a result of this, as you can see here, he shocks everybody. Of course, he shocks the people who are observing this, because it's kind of an awful, violent moment. But he also shocks the audience, I think, in 1968 when this movie came out, to think of someone who's that savage, not really an on-screen hero. But anyway, we're almost meant to feel sympathy for these poor bad. They're just regular yakuza. They're no match for him. But he blinds them, which is like too excessive. And that's a nice contrast with Shin no Jo from Bushi no Ichibu. So it's a spectacle of sightlessness. It's coded as a fate worse than death. He deliberately leaves them alive, most of them, but he blinds them, which is like, even worse, I guess, in the context of this movie. So this all goes to show you, or I guess maybe could be taken to mean the films that work within these tropes are using what John Fiske has called the recognition effect. They're applying the kind of the existing tropes or the stereotypes that people are already familiar with and confirming them in the latest film projects, thereby avoiding alienating any of the audience members or sort of challenging the audience to think beyond these two stereotypes. Of course, either way, this is a process of othering the visually impaired individuals on screen, and by extension, anyone who's visually impaired. So I don't think it's a healthy response, but in order to fight beyond it, we have to sort of reward projects like Kawase Naomi's Radiance with greater box office success, because until films like that sort of reach the mainstream audiences that are up to now being fed a diet of envy or sympathy driven depictions, then those depictions will never change. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your comments.